In terms of the governance of space activities in South Africa, we separate the regulation from implementation. So implementation is a function that is led by the Department of Science and Technology, and SANSA being the National Space Agency, which was established in 2009 to implement the National Space Program. The space, whereas the Space Council falls under the Department of Trade and Industry, and it is charged with a regulatory mandate. So SACSA does not have any kind of implementing function. We don't build satellites, we don't operate space systems, we are concerned purely with regulatory activities. And just to make the point that although I've only highlighted 2 departments here, obviously other departments as well play a role, such as the Department of Communications, Defense, Transport, and so on. Now, just to say a few words about the Council for Space Affairs. It's appointed by the Minister of Trade and Industry in terms of the Space Affairs Act, and there are a number of objects there, but let me just quickly go to the composition of the Council, which you see on the slide here, and just to recognize the presence of 3 of my other fellow councillors here in the room today. Dr. Malinga, the head CEO of SANSA, is also a member of the Space Council. Andiswa, Melissa, and Advocate Sekula, also here today, and also members of the Space Affairs Council. In terms of the strategic context, the vision of SACSA is to maintain a regulatory and policy environment that enhances our activities. And basically what we want to do is to create an enabling environment for the South African space community, whether it's the industrial sector or the academic sector or for government, to create an enabling environment where they understand what the regulatory conditions are, and that those are predictable and stable and so on. So the sorts of things that investors need to know. In terms of our priority areas in SACSA, they're summarized in this graphic. So we take the lead in multilateral fora such as COPUOS in terms of the international obligations that South Africa has to maintain. We're involved with regulatory and licensing activities, and we also have an advisory role to the Minister of Trade and Industry. These are some of the key objectives which SACSA is currently engaged with. I will highlight that one of these is the revision of the Space Affairs Act. The Act was passed in 1993, and a lot has happened in the global and national space arena. For example, we didn't have a space agency back in 1993. So the Act is currently being reviewed, and we will expect that the revision of the Act will take into account the evolution that has happened in the space arena, and we expect that there will be perhaps a focusing of SACSA's activities on its regulatory function. This is the operational structure of SACSA. We have a number of committees, as you see on the slide there. And the only reason why I show this slide is to make the point that although you saw the composition of the council there is appointed by the Minister of Trade and Industry, there is provision in the Act for the committees of SACSA to co-opt additional space experts. And we are actually in the process of populating these committees with additional experts to enhance SACSA's capability to develop our national regulatory framework. These are some of the other relevant legal instruments that affect particularly the Earth observation community. So I thought I would just quickly show this. But I don't need to go into this for this particular community. You're all very familiar indeed with all these instruments. Now, one of the legal functions of SACSA is the registration of space objects. This is required in terms of space, our international obligations. Just this year, we ratified the so-called Registration Convention, one of those 5 treaties that I projected earlier on. And in terms of the Registration Convention, we are required to maintain a national register of space objects, which is available on the internet. And there's a screenshot taken from the web site of the Space Council. And you see that there are 2 South African space objects there, both of them Earth observation satellites, the first being Sunsat and the second Sumbandila, of course. In terms of space policy, the national space policy has a fair amount to say in it about the Earth observation, or the contribution of Earth observation to meeting South Africa's development agenda and all the societal benefits that flow from that. And of course, SACSA, together with the other government departments, well, one of the features in our national space policy is the idea of cooperative governance, whereby space is seen to be a cross-cutting issue that is of relevance to a wide number of government departments. And so SACSA works together with these other government departments to make sure that our regulatory efforts are, in a sense, responding to the strategic imperatives of government and of its agencies that are dealing with space-related issues. So now to focus on the licensing framework for Earth observation activities, here are some of the general principles. Imran? 5. Okay. So the general principles is that that SACSA will consider applications from entities that have well-developed plans for the use of, for conducting an activity that falls within our mandate. We will treat applications for orbits and spectrum on a first-come, first-served basis. There's obviously a coordination issue that goes on with ICASA, with ITU, and with the international community. Also, we don't want to get into sort of a paper satellite situation, so applicants for space systems coming to SACSA should have well-developed plans for putting their systems into use. And obviously, in the granting of a license, we would take into consideration whether this is consistent with our national interest and with our foreign policy objectives and so on, and our international obligations. In terms of the license itself, the content of the license enables the licensee to procure launch services and to deploy a satellite in orbit, to operate the licensed space object, and also licenses will be time-bound, obviously, because satellites don't last forever, and at some point the license has to lapse, although the liability of the Republic continues for as long as the object is up there. There are also some other non-SACSA licenses that are involved, which I've just included on that slide for your interest, such as export licenses, control technologies, and so on. In terms of the obligations of the licensee has to maintain operational control of the space system. This is required to ensure the integrity of system operations and also control over potentially sensitive data. Remember that we have this liability in terms of the international community. So if a license is granted to a South African entity to operate a satellite, then we have to be reasonably sure that they will maintain operational control of it. There are a number of compulsory notifications, such as pre-launch and launch notifications, the release order in orbit. What that means is often with satellite missions, particularly small missions, you get multiple space objects being released from the same launcher. And if there's a failure of communications in more than one payload, then you want to avoid a situation where you don't know which object is the South African space object for which the Republic has liability. So there are a number of considerations that go into making sure that even if it fails to communicate, you can identify positively the South African space objects. And then there are also periodic status reports to SACSA, which we then use to inform the United Nations about the status of our space objects. In terms of the obligations of SACSA, obviously it's registration in the National Register, registration with the UN, and then this idea of continuing supervision. So once you launch a space object, you don't just forget about it. There's an ongoing process that goes on for years and years after the object has been put out into space. My time is up. 1 minute? Okay, well, might as well finish slightly early. So I started with a Sumbandila image, or an image of Sumbandila, and I'll finish my talk with an image taken by Sumbandila. And you see there in the red circle where we are. So thank you very much.